Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Friday Seas lecture series. I'm Laura Rozek. I'm the director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies here at Michigan. Thanks for joining us today for our talk, Is the Philippines Asia's Banana Republic? Vertical Disintegration After the Empire, a lecture by Dr. Alyssa Paredes. Just some housekeeping, your cameras and microphones have been disabled for this webinar, but please do use the Q&A function throughout the talk, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So we'll start with announcements with the lectures, and again, question and answer at the end. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Asian Language and Cultures, and the International Institute. And of course, would like to gratefully acknowledge the funding from the United States Department of Education National Resource Center Title Grant for providing funding for these and our other activities. I'd like to highlight a few of our other lecture series that will be that are coming up. We have one on Friday, November 19th in a few weeks. New Quinn Stardom, the remaking of womanhood on screen, creative labor, and the contemporary Vietnamese film industry by Ki Ha Hoang Nguyen from Yale University, and that will be during our usual time. And then on Friday, December 3rd, we'll have Jenny Goldstein here from Cornell University talking about the role of strategic ignorance in Indonesian agrarian development. These will both, again, be remote. And then today, we're really happy to welcome one of our own here from the University of Michigan, Dr. Alyssa Paredes. Right now, she's an LSA Collegiate Fellow in the Department of Anthropology. And after this, beginning in 2022, will be an assistant professor in anthropology. We're so happy to have her here. She's a sociocultural anthropologist with research interests in human environment and metabolic infrastructures of transnational trade. She uses multi-sided, multi-scalar, and multilingual methods to carry out immersive and socially engaged field work in the Philippines and Japan. And we're so happy to have her here. She's already been a great partner here and with CEAS. And so we hope you all enjoy listening to her too. So Alyssa, I will have you give your talk. And thank you again for coming in today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura, for that generous introduction, and to everyone else at CEAS who made this possible. To everyone who's here, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're zooming in from. I'm so pleased to be able to share this little slice of the research that I've been doing. Like Laura said, I'm a current postdoc here at the University of Michigan's Department of Anthropology, which I'll be joining as a faculty member starting fall 2022. And so before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that for those of us here at the University of Michigan, I want to acknowledge that this university has its origins in a land grant from the Anishinaabeg and Wyandot peoples. And this university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on land that's been obtained in generally unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. Knowing, of course, where we live and where we work doesn't change the past, but a thorough understanding of this past and its ongoing consequences can empower us in our learning and in our engagement in and out of the classroom, in and out of these webinars to support flourishing and justice for all beings. And so with that, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. Okay, I trust that you all see what you're supposed to be seeing.
Looks great, Alyssa.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So what do you think of when you hear the term banana republic? So I'd venture to say that for most people, the phrase does not usually conjure images of Southeast Asia. Now, by banana republic, of course, I don't mean the mainstream fashion retailer that we all know from our trips to the shopping mall, though there is certainly something to be said about this brand's commercialization of cultures of colonial expedition and safari aesthetics. So here's an interesting paper idea for those of you who are interested. No, by banana republic, I am referring to the racialized pejorative that for those of us here in North America informs some of the most popular and most stereotypical images that we have of the rest of the hemisphere, particularly of Latin America. And I'll circle back to this discussion in due course. So given the intimate association of the banana republics to places like Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, it might come as a surprise then how often the term is used to describe aspects of Philippine society and its diplomatic relationships. So as early as 1949, Jose P. Laurel, former wartime president between 1943 and 45, used the term banana republic to express his fears of violence erupting at the election polls. Since then, journalists and scholars of all stripes have used the term to describe every Philippine administration from Ferdinand Marcos in office 1965 to 86 to Rodrigo Duterte in office 2016 to the current day. These political pundits cite US intervention in politics, a state of bloodshed and rebellion, the persistence of kleptocracy in high office, a lack of government accountability, and the rampancy of inequality as characteristics that garner this Southeast Asian archipelago the infamous moniker. Now, the Philippines is also Asia's largest exporter of a banana variety called Cavendish, not to be confused, of course, with our local varieties, which are not the concern of this talk. The country ranks second only to Ecuador in global trade in this valuable commodity. And so political allusions to a banana republic are not just idiomatic expressions for the state of political dysfunctionality and corruption in the highest offices of Filipino government. Rather, they are a reminder of the place of the plantation economy in creating these problematic modes of governance in the first place. So here's another thing that the metaphor of a banana republic calls to mind for me. Colloquially, this is a term that's associated with the brazen manipulation of national governments by foreign capital and of how foreign interests deepen the dependence of regional economies on volatile world markets. So in short, to be called a banana republic is to be tied up in a particular set of transnational diplomatic relations with other presumably more powerful political forces. So on this, interestingly, in addition to the words of Filipino political pundits writing in the newspaper, the other place where I discovered this term being used to describe the Philippines was in Japan. Japan is the consumer market where a majority of Philippine bananas are destined. So I found that this term was used by Japanese intellectuals and civil society activists who were involved in the New Left, who were self-critical of their country's dealings with the Asian Third World. Tsurumi Yoshiyuki, the Japanese anti-Vietnam War activist and author of a popular little book called Banana to Nihonjin, or Bananas in the Japanese, used the term banana republic or banana shokuminchi to describe how modern-day forms of Japanese imperialism continue to operate in places like the Philippines. And here's a poster from the NGO that Tsurumi, who you see before you, was deeply involved in. And on this poster, Tsurumi captures the Philippine-Japan relationship with the creative misspelling of banana shokuminchi, where the shoku in shokuminchi for colony is replaced with the homonym shoku for food. So Tsurumi's wordplay has framed the approaches of much of the works of scholarship on the Philippine-Japan connection, which have similarly described this relationship as neo-colonial or as a peaceful invasion, usually operating through food regimes. So in my time here today, I want to historicize and complicate the comparison between the banana republics of the Western and the Eastern hemispheres. In particular, I want to explain how the Philippines would become Asia's so-called banana republic under very different terms than their counterparts in Central America, and why I think that matters for the future of political organizing towards social and environmental justice in Mindanao, in the Philippines, and in the greater Southeast Asian region. To do this, I'm going to focus on what's been called systems of vertical disintegration and on a legal arrangement called contract growership as key factors that differentiate the Philippines from its Central American counterparts in the earlier half of the 20th century. As I'll explain, these growerships based on buyer-seller contracts are a central tool for externalizing the human and environmental costs associated with growing export quality bananas. I'll end on a note how this has implications for the Philippines' Southeast Asian neighbors, where new boom and bust economies in bananas have just started to spring up in the last 5 years in places like Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So allow me to begin by way of a personal anecdote to contextualize this work on Mindanao's plantation economies in contemporary Philippine studies. Why make this turn to economies of agrarian capital in an age when the country has largely turned its eyes to economies of human capital? In other words, the export not of crops or of products, but of human people, and the labor and migration issues that accompany the export of Filipino workers. So several years ago, I had a conversation with a dear friend and an eminent Philippine studies scholar. I was a graduate student at the time and was telling him about this idea that I had to do a dissertation on the banana plantations of Mindanao. And hearing me describe my research, he said it had a certain patina to it, reminiscent of the old school agrarian political economy research that had so marked Philippine scholarship of the 1980s. Of course, he meant by patina, he meant it as a compliment, and that's exactly how I took it. But patina also denotes something that's valuable for its age, right? And as such, it invites the question, is Philippine agrarian studies and its allied fields of environmental anthropology and environmental history somehow old school? So what we've learned from recent years seem to suggest otherwise. As some of you may already know, in 2019, the Philippines was identified as the deadliest country for environmental defenders in the world. That same year, the Philippines was also announced the country most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Now, not too long ago, I was listening to a speech by the eminent climate activist Naomi Klein, and I was astounded to hear her use the term Pinatubo strategy, referring to Mount Pinatubo, the active volcano in the Central Luzon region. She used the Philippine reference as a catch-all phrase for the fixes proposed, the sort of technocratic geoengineering fixes proposed to deal with our warming world. So important figures like Naomi Klein are increasingly turning to the Philippines to understand global phenomenon. And of course, I would also be remiss not to bring up these images currently circulating on the internet, which were taken at the COP26 or the 2021 UN climate change conference that's happening in Glasgow. So on the pictures before you, you see on a large screen an image of Datu Kailo, who very tragically lost his life in an airstrike in Kitaw-Tao, Bukidnon. He was a very vocal environmental defender, especially against extractive industries. And on the other picture, you have presumably some photos of Filipino activists holding up a banner that says, "Stop the attacks against people and the planet." And on the banner, you see an image of presumably a Philippine tamaraw, a little tarsier there on the bottom, a Philippine eagle on the side, and then in the middle, a picture of an indigenous person raising his fist like this. So as you can see, concerns over the threat of extractive industries and indigenous self-determination and the well-being of Filipino land defenders is very much on the global stage. And yet, scholarly attention to food, agriculture, and the environment has somewhat wavered in the context of mass outmigration. And more recently, the rise of spectacular forms of extrajudicial violence that have been normalized under the Duterte administration. So in the spirit of Filipino American History Month, which was just concluded last month, I should acknowledge that Filipino American immigrants and immigrant families constitute the second largest population of Asian Americans in the US. Filipinos on the move also make up a major segment of the world's seafarers, domestic workers, and caregivers in and beyond the medical field. This is what I was referring to as the export of human capital, right? So a robust set of scholarship, of these are just a very, very small selection, has investigated these important and increasingly timely issues, which will continue to be relevant for our age of increased global movement. I would encourage anyone with an interest to check out these titles. But as the Philippine economy, and to an extent scholarship with it, has turned its sights to human export, there also seems to be a way that agrarian life and environmental concerns have been sidelined in the discourse. The Philippines is still an agrarian country, and it has always been at the forefront of the Green Revolution historically. To cite the words of critical agrarian scholar June Boras, agriculture is still the central ground in and around which the rural poor construct, defend, maintain, and consolidate their diverse livelihoods, end quote. Recent years in particular have highlighted in the starkest possible terms how these should be central to scholarship in the 21st century. And by the way, these are images of the artworks by the recently deceased Filipino painter Neil Doloricon, whose social realism has always pointed to the agricultural field as a center of Filipino collective social woes. So with these reflections in mind, I carried out my immersive fieldwork on the plantation economies of Mindanao in the southern Philippines. Mindanao is the country's epicenter of industrial agriculture, and as such has been dubbed in the language of the state as the country's fruit basket. Now, I conducted this research between 2015 and 2018 for a total of 24 months, split equally between the Philippines and Japan. In the Philippines, my field sites were concentrated in the heart of Mindanao's banana zones, especially in the provinces of Davao del Sur, Davao del Norte, and Cotabato. In these provinces, a great many people live on the peripheries of industrial plantations for rubber, for sugarcane, Cavendish bananas, pineapple, and oil palm, which occupy a total of 500,000 hectares. This is the result of a century of plantation expansion during and after foreign and settler colonial influx into the island. Now, with the support of government agencies and the cooperation of local subsidiaries and smallholders, foreign companies eye thousands more hectares for the purpose of industrial cultivation in the years to come. Now, 500,000 hectares may account for only 12% of the island's total surface area, but there can be no doubt that well beyond this statistic, plantations disproportionately engulf facets of Mindanaoan agrarian life. So allow me to enumerate only a few examples of how this is the case and why I think industrial plantations should be central to the ways we understand Philippine political life. So first, Mindanao is often described as a peri-colonial zone, given its brief but violent and formative experience under direct American colonial administration between 1903 and 1914. American established plantations in hemp, coconuts, and cane, the first instances of industrial agriculture in the Philippine South, have historically been a core machinery for the concentration and insistence on colonial authority. Mindanao and its lush tropical forests are a seat of the country's biological diversity. Plantations, factories in the fields, are a central project through which landscapes, plants, pests, and people are defined and manipulated. Today, Mindanao conceives of itself as an ethnically diverse landscape made up of Christian settlers, Muslim Moros, and the indigenous Lumad. In this context, plantations have served as sites where that ethnic difference is hierarchized, operationalized, and ultimately sustained. My friends and my family who still live in the Philippines often associate Mindanao fairly or unfairly with its unstable peace and order situation. In this political context, plantations are a main source of local communities' most volatile power asymmetries, and they serve as a primary engine for the militarization and the paramilitarization of this region. Plantations are a source of these volatilities, even as authorities propose them as tools for peace building and for insurgency control. Finally, in Mindanaoan provinces marked for sluggish and fragmented economies that have produced some of the poorest cities in the country, locals' transactional and extra-transactional relationships with plantations via buyer-seller contracts, agriventure agreements, and leases remain both the major driver of smallholders' destiny of debt and an imagined mechanism out of it. So thoroughly have these agricultural estates marked the social, political, and environmental milieu that they have served as prisms for understanding the formation of the regions and the country's core social institutions and its position in global capitalist divisions of labor writ large. So what of banana plantations specifically? Approximately 68,000 hectares of Mindanao's prime agricultural lands have been dedicated to plantations for Cavendish bananas. This is the singular commercial variety for global export. Filipino locals generally don't consume this tasteless variety, preferring the sweeter, smaller, and thinner-skinned Latundan, Lakatan, Sabah varieties instead. Yet despite the absence of virtually any domestic consumer interest, export-oriented banana plantations have come to occupy 16 of the 22 Mindanao provinces, spanning the Davao, Northern Mindanao, and Central Mindanao regions. The banana plantation industry is driven by actors who wield significant social, political, and economic clout. For decades, it served as a feeder into the seat of the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture and into elected positions in provincial governors' mansions and seats in Congress. More recently, members of the banana elite have demonstrated their ability to influence the outcomes of national elections as well. The Florendo Lagdameo clan of banana magnates, headed by former Davao del Norte Representative Antonio Tony Boy Florendo Jr., was the largest donor to the 2016 presidential campaign fund of Rodrigo Duterte, pictured here. These banana elites helped to elect a local strongman into the highest political office. So direct channels between private enterprise and local and national governments have perpetuated a culture of political violence and impunity within the banana sector. It's hardly surprising that Mindanao's banana zones are a hotbed for organized labor movements and mass strikes, so common that they appear as a regular fixture of the region. Protesters regularly adopt dark imagery in their visuals. And here's a picture from a 2018 protest against Sumifru, the Philippine subsidiary of the Japanese conglomerate Sumitomo and the country's second largest exporter of bananas. So these aren't Halloween costumes, folks. These are actual pictures that represent the general tenor of mass demonstrations spurred by the abuses of banana companies. These slogans of protest unflinchingly point to the industrial plantation as a threat to life itself. Sumifru, murderer. Hanggat may hacienda at plantasyon, uusbong ang mga martir. As long as there are haciendas and plantations, martyrs will continue to sprout. This regime floats on peasant blood. Baklasin ang mga sagingan at iba pang plantasyon. Uproot the banana plantations and others like it. Or simply, plantations kill. So for many of these political activists, parallels with the Latin American landscape have always been an embodied experience. Now, those who have witnessed the police abductions under the Marcos regime will recall the days when Maa, this is a barangay in Davao City, was commonly referred to as Maanagua, the capital of Nicaragua. And Agdao, another barangay in Davao City, was called Nicaragdao. Now, it seems appropriate at this juncture to return to the question that we set out at the beginning. Is the Philippines Asia's banana republic? And what are the social political foundations that have produced this current state of plantation life in Mindanao that we've just heard about? How are those foundations different from what we might have seen in the original banana republics on the other side of the world? So to address these questions, we should note that in Latin America, the term banana republic is synonymous with the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita Brands, the tropical fruit conglomerate that dominated Central America in the early 20th century. Backing United Fruit's incursion into the region were repressive military regimes, which granted the company all the logistical steps necessary for the vertical integration of its operations. This included tariff exemptions, access to public lands, and permission to carve out of the tropical forests vast rail systems, harbors, electrical grids, and agricultural estates. Charles Kepner and J. Henry Soothill, some of the first to publicly critique United Fruit Company in Central America, captured the dynamics of state-corporate collusion, saying, "The banana empire is the expansion of an economic unit to a size and power that in itself it assumes many of the prerogatives and functions usually assumed by political estates. The United Fruit Company, rather than relying upon the State Department to pull diplomatic wires, trains its own political representatives to deal with Caribbean governments. This corporation not only monopolizes the banana trade in the most important producing regions, but also can speak with such force that politicians accede to its will, end quote. So for these reasons captured by Kepner and Soothill, United Fruit Company was dubbed El Pulpo, the octopus, an image that illustrates its tentacular grips on all aspects of society. Vertical integration became the business model most associated with El Pulpo's style of conducting itself in Central America. This was a model that was founded on foreign banana companies entering into a locale and establishing direct production on dramatic scale. Direct production necessitated corporate control over everything from systems of transportation, communication, law, land tenure, labor recruitment, etc. Elements that were all quote unquote integrated as United Fruit's assets. So indeed, by the 1930s, the banana multinational was Guatemala's largest landowner. And this foreign-dominated landholding pattern and the compromises that it made to national sovereignty would become the trademark of the banana republics of the Americas. Excuse me. So there's a voluminous scholarship concentrated on Latin America that is dedicated to the United Fruit Company and its exploits. Rarely, however, has this corpus of work noted that when United Fruit Company confronted various issues in the 1950s, it turned to the Philippines as a potential site for diversifying its production locations and protecting its investments. As the United Fruit Company set its eyes east, its plans for the Philippines' new banana plantation economies would not simply replicate the patterns of extraction and accumulation that they had become infamous for in the Americas. No. Instead, the Philippine banana industry would become part of a global shift away from multinationals' vertical integration of production towards its disintegration. In other words, what we see in the Philippines is a transition from a production model founded on direct production and corporate control of resources and infrastructure towards a dual model where some plantations continued to operate on that structure, but others divested those assets and relied heavily on domestic partners legally bound to multinational corporations via something called the legal contract. So I should clarify that in this, before I proceed, I should clarify that in this presentation, I'm solely concerned with buyer-seller contracts, also known as growership contracts, and not at all with labor contracts, like the kinds that a plantation laborer might maintain with their employer, though those are certainly equally contentious and deserving of analysis. So bureaucratic apparatuses like buyer-seller contracts, basically these are sheets of paper with a bunch of signatures, right? Hardly conjure the drama or the spectacle of that stories of Yankee imperialists in the tropics usually do. But to me, that's what the story is, right? Contract growing represented no less than a dramatic and spectacular restructuring of the processes of capitalist accumulation. And it would shape the nature of political struggle in Mindanao profoundly. So geographer Michael Watts wrote that contracting is vertical coordination without vertical integration. This is a form of vertical disintegration because the economic and environmental risks associated with the production process are formally divested and distributed across a variety of actors in the supply chain. It's no longer concentrated within the control of the multinational exporter company. So a few words on contract growing in practical terms. So in the Philippine banana context, contract growing is an arrangement wherein a multinational corporation passes on the production process to local growers. This arrangement is bound by the legal contract, that sheet of paper, which specifies the quality, the quantity, and the price for which it intends to buy the commodity. So I know that growers' contracts might seem like basically the stuff of business everywhere, but here I want to describe them to you as the central object that creates the volatilities that have come to define plantation life, like you've heard about earlier. Line by line, these contracts detail operational matters like the location of the plantation, how its products are going to be priced, appropriate strategies for pest and disease control, methods for chemical application, acceptable cosmetic standards for export, etc. These are terms that the corporations design, but that growers carry out at their own expense. So you can already kind of see how there might be an opening for some unfair practices there, but we'll talk more about that later. But these contracts also detail more remarkable elements as well. What happens in the event of a strike, a revolution, or a war? Who is released from the terms of the agreement and who is not? How will disputes between banana growers and their corporate buyers be arbitrated? And in the case of, in the case that a subject matter in the contract is outside the knowledge, the understanding, or the contemplation of one of the parties, what can or can't you renegotiate? So I actually just want to take a moment here to share with you just a really short clip to demonstrate the realities around these massively consequential documents. So this is a 1 minute clip of this is a 1 minute clip of a video of a banana grower named Rolando Torrentera. And it's from a video documentary that's been produced by Oxfam. Give me just 1 second while I figure out how to do this, you guys. Okay. And please excuse the overly dramatic music. Okay. Can I have a verbal confirmation from somebody that you're seeing what you're supposed to see?
Yes, it's up, Alyssa.
Okay,
Looks great.
Great.
Pag-award na yun, so na kontrata nga among ipirmahan. Gikan kay ang first priority nga mag-transact din katumang yung owner company. Kay murag dili gyud tanan nga i-explain gyud pag-ayo sa Sumipro. So napatoy mga support ginagmay sa una sa kumpanya. So moto nga wala lang gid namo wala lang gid mi bisan gani nag-repair sa mga lawyer sa may abogado. Kami wala po nagtanaw kung sa sulod na maayo. Kay usa man gud atong nagpirmahan katong naay palaman mga signing bonus. So pagpirma na ako, wa ko kasabot sa akong gibati. Malipay nga makapanagiya kag yuta. Pero wa po di mo mahuna, wa mo minagunahuna ug unsay kalisod ng umabot.
All right. Thanks for that, everyone. So this video gives us a sense of how these contracts are just shrouded in secrecy and opacity, right? How they're commonly associated with feelings of confusion, bewilderment, and regret. Now, despite the fact that these contracts serve as the very linchpin on which the industry and its modalities of accumulating capital stands, in the years that I spent in the Mindanao banana heartland, never once was there a time when contracts were openly shared with me. Not uncommonly, growers with contractual ties to the banana companies, like the folks that you heard about from the short video, would tell me about their copies having gone missing, that they had been mysteriously burnt in an office fire, or that they had been handed over to an unidentified relative for safekeeping. Now, I noticed that locals had a tendency to refer to their contracts in terms of their expiry, counting down the years until the agreement could be renegotiated or abandoned at long last. Contracting with local growers was not how United Fruit Company operated in swaths of Central America in the earlier half of the 20th century. So what made it make this shift in the Philippines at this time? So back in Central America, the political infrastructures that had made the region so accommodating to banana imperialism, founded on vertical integration, were coming under severe question. Just as Philippine President Carlos P. Garcia in office 1957 to 61 welcomed the United Fruit's proposal in 1958, that same company had been facing intense nationalist pressures, labor militancy, and government-driven land expropriation in Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Panama. This compelled the company, as it was looking elsewhere, but also as it was reinventing itself in Latin America, to consider a less politically prominent, but also a less economically risky mode of production. So they landed on this contract system. So what did the contract system mean for the industry's main stakeholders in the Philippines? What did the formal distribution of risk in the production process actually imply for those who are tethered to this industry? And how exactly has it changed the shape of agrarian political struggle in Mindanao? So we can address these questions through the perspective of three major categories of actors. I'll describe exporter corporations, growers, and importer corporations, or the consumer market. So let's turn first to Filipino exporter corporations. Today, these are Dolstan Philco, Sumifru Philippines, Unifruity Tropical Philippines, Del Monte Philippines, La Panday, etc. Some of you might recognize some of these names. For these groups, working through contract agreements meant that the banana industry would consolidate control over the Mindanao's most agriculturally productive lands, but largely without the costs of direct production or ownership. And I realize that this picture is probably a little bit hard to appreciate, but the picture makes it look like a vast ocean in front of you. This is not an ocean. This is a very, very, very large banana plantation. So that's the green that you see is the treetops. So by minimizing their fixed assets, exporter corporations were freed from a variety of risks, including those posed by changing weather conditions. They were assured of supply without bearing the high costs of land and machinery. They would not have to deal with any increases in permanent labor and were absolved of any obligations to pay legislated wage increases and benefits for workers, which was a responsibility that was then passed on to growers. Corporations would not have to worry about dealing with labor disputes, as most of the farm workers are technically have as their employers these growers that they've sort of distributed those responsibilities to. So releasing themselves from direct control over production had another important effect. It decreased the potential for nationalist resentment, like the kind that United Fruit had fueled in Latin America. Placing the industry in the hands of domestic growers would make it easier for representatives of the sector, as well as government bodies, to frame the Philippine banana industry as farmer-oriented, as a vehicle to further Philippine development through the autonomous accumulation of Filipino capital. At the same time, exporters were able to reassert considerable indirect control through a monopoly over chemicals, expertise, credit, and above all, access to the overseas market. So let's move on to these contract growers. Now you'll remember that under this system, the responsibilities and costs of production are divested by the company and handed over to these small growers. In practice, what this means is that the corporations dictate the schedule for planting and harvesting, dictate the schedule and amount of expensive fertilizers and pesticides to be applied, and they simply charge the growers for the costs of all those things. They also charge other things like rent for hard machinery that have been used, wharf fees, and other costs for transport. Now, these costs only get higher with each passing year, even as the price that's paid to buy these bananas is contractually stuck at, say, $2.50 per box for an average of 10 years, sometimes more. Now, $2.50 for a 13.5 kilogram box of bananas is a very, very, very low price. There's generally maybe somewhere between 100 to 120 single individual bananas in every 13.5 kilogram box. So there were points in history, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, when the costs that were associated with producing export quality bananas were so high that they exceeded the selling price. And what that meant was that being a contracted banana grower actively made you poorer than you were to begin with, right? You lost money by selling bananas, basically. The Diamond Farms Co-op, for instance, lost about 30 million pesos in their first year of operations, and Checkered Farms lost about 11 million pesos. These are both growers cooperatives that are contracted with Dole Stanfilco. Now, circumstances of looming debt has changed somewhat as growers cooperatives have linked up with legal advocacy groups to abrogate these onerous contracts. But there remain numerous instances when growers are simply at a loss for how exporters have been calculating the figures that are charged to them. So in fieldwork, for instance, I've seen how this has left smallholders with no recourse but to enlist as plantation laborers, literally employees on their own plots of land. Food insecurity is an everyday reality in these spaces that are so defined by looming debt. And this is reflected in incisive protest imagery that's come out of plantation strikes. So they read, "Naia-adobo ba ang saging? Naisisigang ba ang saging? Naikakaldereta ba ang saging?" Like, you know, can you turn bananas into adobo? Can you turn bananas into caldereta? Can you turn bananas into sinigang? These are sort of classic Filipino dishes, you know, the everyday fare. They read, "On the banana plantations of Sumifru, there isn't any justice, there isn't even anything to eat." But here's the rub. Yes, contracting has proven to be an exploitative and deeply asymmetrical production system that has left many growers buried in debt and food insecure. But growers will have entered into these legal arrangements and signed the dotted line of their own volition as free agents. So sure, coercive practices are an absolute reality in these spaces, but as far as the legalities are concerned, this was not a decision from on high as it was in any obvious way as it was in Central America, where dictators sealed the fate of many with the strokes of their pen. No, growers signed those contracts. This is an arrangement that they entered into themselves. So why do they do it? Why do these growers enter into these contractual agreements? Because the legal contract is as much a tool for his subordination and institutional capture as it is a tool for his autonomy as a peasant producer. Becoming a contracted grower through vertically disintegrated models of production turned Mindanao's settler populations, these are mostly members of the rural poor from the northern and central regions of the Philippines, into their own class of settler entrepreneurs. With contract in hand, they would be assured of forecasted income and of buyers, and of newly able to access foreign markets, technology for a technology transfer, infrastructure assistance, and credit through their transactions with these exporter companies. Quite unlike their Central American counterparts who had labored under, white Yankee cowboys, with the contract system, these Mindanaoan settlers would become their own managers, their own supervisors, and their own foremen. And as their own managers, they would come to dream of a vision of justice tied not to the expulsion of a foreign-dominated industry, as we saw in Central America, but rather to their ability to claim for themselves a greater slice of that economic pie. And in practice, what this means is that contract growers are at times just as likely to defend the machinations of industrial agriculture as their multinational counterparts. And here's an image that I thought really captured this quite well. This is of a poster that I took on the side of the plantation that reads, "Why bite the hands that feed us?" So such Filipino complicity in plantation-driven exploits complicates the Banana Republic narrative and its embedded allegations of a second Japanese colonization in the Philippines, right? True, Cavendish bananas are grown for the Japanese and other foreign markets, but this oversimplified vilification of the Japanese as colonizer shrouds the structural forms of corporate violence as it operates more often than not in the hands of fellow Filipinos themselves. So last, let's turn to these Japanese importers, the Japanese consumer market. And I'm not going to say too much about these guys. But what's important to remember is that under the contract growership scheme, the Japanese market is positioned primarily as a buyer and nothing else. And as mere buyers of product, they have been more than willing to turn a blind eye to the multitudes of injustices that erupt on the plantation grounds from which they source. While in Japan, I found that the folks who were attached to the supply chain, Japanese traders, Japanese technicians, middlemen of all sorts, were largely ignorant of the goings-on their very own supply chains, whether these were strikes, chop downs, barricades, etc., the images that you see before you. These seem to have no perceived effect on the supply volumes on the Japanese consumer end. No one knew that these were happening, and it was very easy to just turn a blind eye. Such ignorance, willful or not, makes holding Japanese importer corporations accountable extremely difficult. Activist friends in Japan discovered this themselves as they rallied against Sumitomo Corporation, the parent company of Sumitomo Philippines. Now, in 2018, this was actually a partner protest to, you might remember the slide where, you had a bunch of sort of zombie-looking figures wrapped in bandages and carrying a large banana bunch. Well, this was basically the partner protest that was happening in Japan. So in 2018, a Tokyo-based civil group launched a small but meaningful campaign in political solidarity with the Union of Plantation Laborers from Compostela Valley. In Japan, supporters of the movement lined the sidewalks in front of Sumitomo's headquarters with protest banners that read, "Your blood is in our bananas. The bananas you eat are killing Filipino workers." So in the midst of these allegations, how did the Japanese corporation Sumitomo respond? Well, it simply sold 49% of its stake in Sumitomo Philippines to a joint venture partner. Now, there's no direct quote from the company representative saying that this was indeed a strategy, but those involved in the campaign widely interpreted this as the company basically shrugging off its responsibilities over the matter. So in closing, I find myself wanting to return to the metaphor of El Pulpo, or the octopus. With the advent of contractualized industrial agriculture, we might say that the Philippines, Asia's banana republic, is a headless octopus, El Pulpo sin cabeza, possessing the same tentacular grip, but this time without a centralized source of that foreboding power. By operating through contract agreements, the plantation industry's control has been reintegrated under dispersed conditions. No one body can be held accountable. This makes the nature of control and the project of social justice so much more subtle than the metaphor of a banana republic and its original notions of economic imperialism are able to capture. But the story doesn't stop there. In recent years, we've seen the emergence of boom and bust economies sprout in Kachin State of Myanmar, Vientiane City in Laos, and Kampot Province in Cambodia. Appearing in these regions as recently as 2015, these new banana plantations are driven by emerging Asian economies, especially China. Interestingly, their expansion and modernization also seems to be aided by Filipino technicians pirated from Mindanao. Representatives of the Filipino banana industry have begun speaking about a so-called brain drain they are currently witnessing with the out-migration of Filipino plantation expertise to these new frontiers in the Southeast Asian mainland. So what kind of banana republic will these Filipino experts install there? What new formulas for externalizing social and environmental costs will mark these places? Already, researchers have identified issues around Chinese investors not registering their commercial presence, labor practices contravening laws, land conflicts emerging around coercion, harassment, and misinformation, and unregulated chemical fertilizers and pesticides running off into local ecological systems. Now, ironically, in these places, transparent contract models have been proposed as a solution to the lack of transparency and regulation in these new banana zones. Hopefully, lessons from the Philippines' banana republics will serve as a canary in the coal mine. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for the great talk. That was really, I'm trying to think. That it was a really good talk. It was so much information in that talk. And I want to invite anybody who has questions to type into the question and answer. But I'd like for you to expand on where else in Southeast Asia these growers are going and with other countries. And is there any reaction from the countries that they're moving into regarding these? You said that the contracts are becoming a little bit more transparent, but what is that the result of?
Well, it's actually it's a great question because we're just starting to figure this out. And I mentioned a couple of places in Southeast Asia on the mainland where these new banana plantations have sprouted, and Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam are part of them. And the reason why it's been, and again, like these have been as recent as like 5 or so years ago. The reason why we are only finding this out now is because governments have actually had an incredibly difficult time following the emergence of these banana plantations, mostly because so many of them aren't, they're not commercially registered, right? So they actually operate illicitly. They're basically illicit. So I wish I could give you like actual statistics on this, but without actually going there on the ground, it's extremely difficult to know. And as for whether contract-based systems, well, the reality right now is that what it seems to be is that where they are operating right now, it seems to be that they don't operate on contractual models, right? It's all kind of extra transaction, like extra contractual transactions that kind of seem to be the modus operandi on these plantations. So this is kind of a cop-out from answering your question directly, Laura, but the real answer is we're going to find out. We're going to have to find out in the next couple of years, right? Yeah.
Well, and I know just from work, colleagues that work in e-waste and things, it's so hard to trace the electronic waste. I mean, that's the big problem. We know it's the electronic waste recycling is happening inappropriately, but it's hard to find. And actually now people are really starting to put in questions. William Turcello, this was another question I had, asked, are palm oil plantations using the same model?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is not it's not an industry that I know particularly well, but my understanding is yes. In the Philippines, that they do operate on contract-based models. I wouldn't be surprised if like the banana plantation industry, they really kind of use it like a dual structure, by which I mean, so one portion of the some of the oil palm will be sourced on land will be sourced from land that is contracted with growers, like you've heard about, and another might be sourced from land that these oil palm plantations actually run themselves, meaning they will they'll lease out or they'll rent out land from small landholders and establish a corporate managed plantation on that plot of land. So this is the dual structure that is the case for bananas and is likely also the case for oil palm. Yeah, but it's, I mean, I'd be super curious, like if you're familiar, if you're personally familiar with William, with oil palm in the Philippines or in other parts of Southeast Asia, I'd be really curious to hear more about the legal arrangements that they operate on. Yeah, thanks for the question.
We have another question from Brian Klein, who said, phenomenal talk. Alyssa, completely agree. That was mesmerizing. And asked the question, what's the process for growers who want to contest violations of their contracts by buyers in courts? In your experience, how does the judicial system seem to arbitrate these disputes in terms of fairness, et cetera?
This is a really great question. Thanks so much for being here, Brian, and thanks for asking. So this is maybe one way I can get into this is by sharing a little personal anecdote, and I'll be careful to anonymize everything. But I actually had the pleasure of meeting one person previously somewhere here in the United States, not in the Philippines, and they had actually been a former lawyer in a very prestigious law firm based in Makati. This is the business district, business district of Manila, and they had actually shared with me that one of their a significant client, some of their more significant clients were banana corporations, and always the cases that were brought to their desk had to do with the breaking of contracts or the breaches in contracts in one way or the other, right? And so the reason that I share the context of this being in the United States and the fact that this was a a very prestigious firm in the business district of Manila, right, is because you can already see the sort of asymmetries there, right? Here you have on the one hand banana corporations who are working with the most powerful legal firms in the country. These are firms that are peopled with lawyers who are coming from the most prestigious law schools in the whole world. I mean, some of them, yes, just really prestigious, really well-trained lawyers who are at the they're the cutting edge of this line of work, right? Whereas on the other hand, you have these small growers who they hire, they hire like in this particular case that I heard about, my lawyer friend was telling me, there was a real, they were saying, I forget the term that they actually used, but they were saying that there was kind of a mismatch in the legal weights of in the weight of the legal team, because, one of them was coming from all the way up here and the other one was coming from all the way down here. But to kind of try and answer your question more directly, Brian, what's the process for growers who want to contest violations to their contracts by buyers in court? It actually more often happens the other way around, right? It more often happens that it's exporter corporations who are charging their the growers with breaching the contracts, so it's always kind of the growers kind of at a position on the receiving end of these legal threats, right? And the only case that I can think of where it operates the other way around, I actually can't think of another case where it's operating the other way around. There have been times when small growers will want to renegotiate the terms of their contract. So for instance, that $2.50, maybe they've realized that actually $2.50 for 10, 15 years is actually too low of a price. What they'll do is they'll partner with these legal advocacy groups. There's one very prominent one called Farm Co-op. And they'll partner with them to try and renegotiate those terms. And sometimes that works. And a lot of the times it depends. It depends on the corporation that they're dealing with. There's one particular corporation that has sort of established a reputation as being very warm to these requests for renegotiating their terms, but a vast majority of the other ones have been, a lot harder in terms of, the leeway that they give for these kinds of things. And sometimes, I hope that that's answered a little bit of what you were trying to get at, Brian.
Well, I just keep thinking as you talk about pesticide use and whether these are even regulated at all, the amount of pesticides used must be massive, and the health effects on people. And anyway, I there's a bunch of questions. I know I could talk to you a little bit after, but
and
the lack of regulation.
Talk about pesticides.
Sorry, right? The lack of regulation is just stunning. So Matthias Feiberger is asking to what extent the contracting system affected the average size of plantations in Mindanao. Has it facilitated the expansion of plantations to achieve economies of scale?
That is an excellent question. I've never thought about it that way, whether the contracting system has actually helped with plantation expansion or somehow made it easier for plantations to expand. Let's answer it this way. Contracting, I'm not sure this is not a direct answer to your question, Matthias. Sorry, I'll have to think about that more. But one thing that the contract system has meant is that there is a lot more fluidity in the size and the scale of plantations. So for instance, when you have the opposite, the other side of the structure, which is the corporate managed plantation. This is usually a set plot of land that the corporation has rented out from smallholders, right? So there's a little bit more fixity. there's a little bit more fixity to corporate managed plantations. These are usually the plantations that have received the most amount of corporate investment. They're used as model plantations. So, if there are visitors from Japan who want to come see how things are going, those are the plantations that people are shown. They're the nicest ones. They're the best taken care of ones. Some of them are really remarkable. They're really actually like enclaves unto themselves. There's one particular one that, there's a bowling alley in there. There's a chapel. There's a hospital. there are schools in there. There's a grocery store in there. These are the best ones, and there's a lot of fixity to those. But with these other ones that grow, the plantations that are built on these growers' contracts, because there's a lot of entering into contracts, leaving contracts, abrogating contracts, renegotiating the contracts, they tend to be a lot more patchwork. They tend to be a lot more patchwork, and that can mean that the boundaries of the plantation are a lot more expandable and contractable than one would presume, right? And I say that because often when we hear the word plantation, we think of a square plot of land that is, Dole's plantation, right? But actually the boundaries of the plantation, because of this particular legal setup, really is a lot more fluid and is changing all the time. And actually a lot of the plantations, well, not a lot, some of the plantations that I did fieldwork on, they don't exist anymore. They're covered in weeds now. They've just been abandoned. So it's fascinating. It's a great question. Thank you.
So I know we have to wrap up, but Hugh Fung, Hugh just asked a question that I think would be kind of fun to end on with a quick answer, because I wanted to ask this too. And she thanked you for your fascinating lecture. You mentioned that local people prefer different kinds of bananas. Do you think there will be a trend that local people will change their taste of bananas due to the maybe the lower price? And I think this is hilarious because when I first took my kids to Southeast Asia and they ate a banana, their eyes were huge. So I think this is a good thing to say. Do you think their taste in bananas will change due to lower prices?
Okay, this is a really fun question. And I do not think that, so yes, Filipinos don't eat Cavendish bananas in general. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that they don't like the taste, which is what I mentioned. In fact, the only place where you will find a Cavendish banana available to a Filipino consumer is at Starbucks. If you buy like one of those single pack bananas at Starbucks, those are Cavendish bananas. So they don't like the taste, Filipinos, and I don't see those tastes changing at any point soon. The other reason why Filipino consumers don't eat Cavendish bananas is because they are not available on the domestic market, and that's a very intentional thing that plantation corporations do. Right? It's actually one of the lines on the contract. You cannot sell even the reject bananas. You cannot sell these by reject bananas, I mean the bananas that are like they're blemished, they're misshapen, they're wrong size. You can't sell them on the domestic market because plantations don't want to create competition. So they intentionally keep those bananas from ever entering into the domestic market in the first place, so that they don't so that they can keep maintaining those low prices. And there was one other thing that I wanted to say about this, which is that in the Philippines on taste. The folks and this gets back a little bit to chemicals, there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, like folk knowledge around Cavendish bananas on the plantation's peripheries. The folks who live there, they generally refer to these Cavendish bananas as stampelco, which is like kind of a colloquial word for stanfilco, which is the Dole subsidiary. Mm-hmm. So they'll call the bananas stampelco after the company, or they will call it saging ng Hapon, which means bananas for the Japanese. And I've met a number of folks who believe that if you eat the bananas for the Japanese, they give you stomach aches. They're not only not tasty, they will also give you blood in your stool and things like this. And part of that is because the folks around the plantation are aware of the amount of chemicals that are being used to grow these very chemically intensive commodities. So that's my answer to Hugh's fun question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that was a great question. All right, and with that, Alyssa, thank you again for coming. It was a fascinating talk. And thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you in a few weeks on November 19th. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.